Don't shoot. A hoarse voice rang out in the scorching desert. Ethan Carter was startled, gripping the Winchester tightly, his eyes fixed on the short grass where the sound came from. The wind whipped up red dust in swirls. The harsh sunlight seemed to burn the dry, cracked ground. From the bushes, an Apache woman rushed out, collapsing on the hard ground. Dried blood stained her arms, dust covered her tanned face. Right behind her, a smaller figure staggered after her. The young girl collapsed, her breathing rapid, her lips dry and chapped. The older sister immediately turned around, shielding her younger sister, her deep black eyes burning with despair. Her voice rose, each word heavy as a knife. "We will give birth to your children. Just let us live." The words hit Ethan like a hammer. The image of his wife, Martha, on her sickbed, fever burning her every breath, begging for life to feed their young son, flashed through his mind. But just a few days later, they had both left this world, leaving him alone on the empty ranch. The Winchester's barrel trembled slightly. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady his grip. He looked closely at the two women before him, one proud to the point of recklessness, the other on the verge of collapse. Despite their wounds, they stood there, facing him with unyielding eyes. Finally, he took off the water bottle from his waist and threw it on the ground in front of them. "Drink, then follow me." The Carter Ranch gate appeared in the red, dusty afternoon. The wooden pillars were crooked, the roof was faded, the porch was quiet, only an old oil lamp hung. Ethan walked ahead, his footsteps heavy on the ground, his shadow long like a lone traveler. The two sisters staggered behind. The older sister helped the younger sister into the corner of the stable, carefully spreading some dry straw. Ethan folded his arms and looked, his voice hoarse. "Stay there for now. I don't want to be a bother." After saying that, he turned and walked straight home. But as soon as his figure disappeared, the older sister still pulled out the broken-bladed knife hidden in her belt, holding it tightly in her hand. Her eyes were like a wild animal that had just escaped a trap, ready to strike back if forced. The first night, Ethan sat in front of the fireplace. The wooden house was large and empty. The crackling sound of firewood echoed in the silence. He sipped strong coffee, his eyes unconsciously looking out through the crack in the door. From the stable, a small fire flickered. He heard the creak of wood as someone locked the door, then the young girl's soft, rapid cough. His heart sank. It had been a long time since the Carter Ranch had been completely silent, but the sound weak, miserable made him uneasy. Ethan wondered, why did he bring them back? He should have just turned and walked away, like he had so many times in his life. But he couldn't. The next morning, while the sun was still lingering on the mountaintop, Ethan stepped out into the yard. He stopped, surprised. His sister had gotten up early, drawing water from the well to wash her face. Her tanned face still bore the marks of fatigue, but her eyes were bright and determined. Beside her, her younger sister sat leaning against a pillar, her lips still chapped but somewhat alive. Ethan crossed his arms and watched. His sister saw him, paused for a moment, but did not avoid him. She continued to pour water on her face, then picked up a broom and swept the horse stable. No one told her, no one forced her. Around noon, a sudden noise rang out. A small calf broke through the fence and ran wildly into the pasture. Ethan quickly grabbed the rope, but before he could rush away, his sister quickly ran ahead. Although still limping, she cornered the calf, shouted loudly, and herded it back into the stable. The gate slammed shut, dust flying everywhere. Sweat ran down her face, but her eyes were still bright. Ethan stopped, looked for a long time. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, then turned back to fix the fence. In the afternoon, the red sun dyed the prairie a golden yellow. The older sister lit a fire in front of the stable, roasting some leftover jerky. Ethan brought out a mug of hot milk and placed it beside her. She was surprised for a moment, then nodded slightly. They didn't exchange a word, just sat there, one side of the fire, the other side of the milk. For the first time, Ethan felt that the ranch was no longer completely silent. There was another breath, strange yet very real, seeping into the empty space. That night, the desert wind still blew, but the sound of the bolt closing at the stable door rang out like a strange sign. From today, He was no longer completely alone. If you have accompanied Ethan through this fateful encounter, please click subscribe to the channel now. This is just the beginning. Dangerous days lie ahead, as a lone man and two Apache sisters must learn to trust each other to survive in the stormy Wild West. The Arizona morning was bright and sunny, but the atmosphere on the Carter Ranch was different. Ethan woke early as usual, pulling his boots out into the yard to check the fence. But this time, he heard more than just the wind whistling through the pasture. There were also soft footsteps and the sound of a bucket of water from the well. When he turned around, he saw his sister, the Apache woman, who had glared at him the day before pulling a bucket of water. The clear water poured into the wooden bucket, splashing. Beside her, her skinny sister sat against a pillar, her face pale but her eyes no longer blank. "I'm Ahioka," the little girl said softly when she saw Ethan's gaze. "My sister is Nayeli." Ethan just nodded, his broad shoulders slumping under his frayed shirt. "I'm Carter." Then he turned away, saying nothing more. Ranch Carter was large, but with only one man in charge for 3 years, everything gradually deteriorated. The fences were broken, the cow pen smelled, the roof leaked. Ethan was used to doing little by little, just to keep the ranch from collapsing. But that morning, as he was carrying wood to repair the fence, Nayeli suddenly came over and took the hammer from his hand. "Let me." Ethan frowned. "You're still weak. Rest." But Nayeli's eyes were firm. "If we want to stay, we have to work. It's the only way." Without waiting for a reaction, she raised the hammer and slammed the wood into the stake. The sound echoed loudly. Ethan stood still, his eyes glued to the woman's strong shoulders, a strange feeling rising in his heart, both stubborn and admirable. Ahioka, though not yet strong, also dragged some straw out to the drying yard. Her hands were trembling, slender, but her eyes sparkled with determination. Ethan saw, did not stop. At noon, Ethan brought a simple meal, dry bread and some stewed beans. He placed it on the wooden table in the house. But when he sat down, the two sisters were still standing on the porch, their eyes hesitant. "If you want to eat, come in," Ethan said bluntly. Nayeli shook her head slightly. "We'll sit outside. The townspeople, if they find out, they'll say you're sheltering the enemy." Ethan looked at her for a long time, then pushed the bowl of stewed beans closer to the window. "Eat. There's no town to see you here." Finally, Ahioka entered first, sitting timidly at the edge of the table. Nayeli was still standing against the pillar, wary. Ethan didn't force her, but when she saw her sister eating, she gently pulled up a chair and sat down. There was no unnecessary word, just the sound of spoons hitting wood. But in that silence, a small boundary had been crossed. That afternoon, Ethan took the cows out to the field. He stood against the fence, his eyes watching the cattle graze leisurely. Suddenly, the image of his little boy appeared in his mind. The boy who used to run around the herd of cows, his laughter ringing out. The sound was now just an echo in his memory. Ethan tightened his grip on the fence, trying to push back the pain in his chest. But when he turned back, he saw Ahioka sitting on the porch, doodling on the ground with a stick. The drawing was simple: a house, a mountain, and 3 people standing side by side. He froze. The girl looked up, her eyes clear. "I just wanted to draw a family." Ethan didn't answer, just turned away. But his heart was moved. For years, no one had called this ranch family. That night, the wind was blowing. Ethan sat in front of the fireplace, occasionally glancing out the window. Nayeli's figure loomed outside the stable, still holding the broken blade knife in her hand. It was clear she didn't trust him, but instead of being angry, Ethan felt right. How could a woman who had been hunted trust a stranger? When he brought out an old blanket and placed it in front of the stable door, Nayeli looked at him for a long time. She didn't say thank you, just silently took it and covered her sleeping sister. But her eyes were less hateful. In the middle of the night, a loud cow mooing rang out. Ethan jumped up and grabbed his gun. When he ran out into the yard, he saw a calf stuck in the corner of the fence. But before he could do anything, Nayeli rushed forward, knelt down, and tried to lift the heavy wooden stake. "Get out of the way," Ethan shouted, but she strained, and the stake bounced up. The calf escaped, ran around, and disappeared into the herd. Ethan grabbed the steak, closed it, and gasped. Nayeli stood there, panting, sweat beading her forehead. Her gaze met his, no longer just wary, but a gleam of trust. When they returned, Ahyoka was awake, looking at her worriedly. Ethan handed her some warm water, then sat down on the old wooden chair. The flickering fire illuminated three faces, one angular, one determined, one young. No one said anything, but in that silence, one certainty had formed. The Carter Ranch was no longer completely empty. It had more breathing, more hands, more reasons for Ethan to keep getting up each day. The Arizona night was dark, the wind whistling through the old wooden cracks, bringing sand and dust everywhere. Ethan Carter sat alone in the cabin, listening to the silence of the ranch, but the silence was no longer absolute. Occasionally, a soft cough could be heard from the stable, the unsteady footsteps of someone trying to hide their pain. He held the cup of strong coffee, but did not drink it. His intuition told him something was wrong. Putting down the cup, he reached for the oil lamp and walked out into the yard. The pale yellow light shone on the old stable where the two Apache sisters were staying. Through the crack in the door, Ethan saw Nayeli sitting against a wooden pillar, her face pale. Her right leg was temporarily bandaged with a torn cloth, but the dark red color was gradually fading. A fishy, damp smell rose, making Ethan frown. Ahyoka sat beside him, tears in her eyes, trying to apply a wet cloth to the wound, but her small hands were shaking, unable to do anything. Ethan pushed the door open and entered. Ahyoka was startled, quickly covering her sister's leg. "Don't. She's fine." He bent down, his voice hoarse. "What's fine?" "She's feverish." Ethan pulled the cloth away. The deep wound along Nayeli's shin was red and swollen, oozing yellow pus. He took a breath, remembering the times he had dealt with wounded livestock. But this time it wasn't a cow or a horse, it was a woman. A human who looked at him with a mixture of pride and despair. "You have to cut it open, clean it." Ethan stood up, his voice determined. "Otherwise, you'll die." Nayeli bit her lip, not saying anything. But her eyes were fearless, she just nodded slightly. Ahyoka hugged her, panicked. "No, you'll hurt." Ethan put his hand on her shoulder. "If you want your sister to live, I have to do it." He built a small fire in front of the barn. The blacksmith knife was placed on the embers until it glowed red. The smell of burning metal wafted in the air. Ethan prepared hot water, a clean cloth, and some wine left in the bottle. Returning, he handed the piece of leather to Nayeli. "Bite hard." She didn't speak, just gritted her teeth and held it. Sweat was pouring down her forehead, but her back was still straight. Ethan knelt down, his hands steady. The red knife touched the wound. A sizzling sound, acrid smoke billowed out. Ahyoka closed her eyes tightly, tears welling up. But Nayeli, she didn't cry out. Only large drops of sweat fell to the ground, mixing with the dirt. Ethan cut it open, squeezed out the pus, and then washed it away with wine. She trembled, her shoulders shaking with each movement, but her eyes never left his. That gaze intense, unyielding made Ethan's heart heavy. He saw the silhouette of his late wife, who had been just as proud in her final pain. When the bandage was finished, he covered her with a thick blanket. "Rest? It will rain tonight." In the middle of the night, the rain poured down, pattering on the tin roof. Ethan sat in the house, adding firewood to the stove. Suddenly, the door opened. Nayeli walked in, limping, the blanket draped over her shoulders. Her shirt was soaked from the rain, her black hair plastered to her cheeks. Ethan frowned. "You should rest." She didn't answer, just sat down by the fireplace, stretching her tanned hand toward the fire. The orange light fell on her face, highlighting the long scar on her cheek. After a moment of silence, her voice rang out, hoarse but firm. "I had a tribe. I was dragged away by soldiers, tied to stakes, tortured. My sister almost died on the road. My parents, neither survived. I cut the rope, dragged her away, and I haven't slept a single night since." Ethan was silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I lost everything too. Martha and my son. All that's left is this empty house." In the sound of rain and fire, two people sat across from each other, each with their own losses. No need for comfort, No need for promises. Just the presence, enough to ease the loneliness a little. Before returning to the barn, Nayeli placed the ranch's old blanket back on the chair. Over her shoulders, she draped the new blanket Ethan had given her. It wasn't just a blanket swap. It was a silent acknowledgement. From now on, the distance between them was shorter. The next morning, Ethan checked the north fence. The damp ground was marked with unfamiliar hoof prints, heading straight into the ranch and then around. He sat down, touched the tracks. His heart sank. The hunters hadn't given up yet. When he returned, Nayeli was sitting on the porch, her gaze drifting with the wind. He looked at her, knowing that sooner or later, the entire ranch would be swept away by the storm. But this time, he wasn't alone. If you're feeling the tension in the Carter Ranch, subscribe now. Because after this fragile moment of trust, the real storm will hit, and Ethan's choice will change the fate of everyone. The morning in the Arizona prairie was as fiery as ever. The early morning sun shone down, dyeing the grasslands a sea of gold. Ethan Carter stood on the porch, his eyes on the north fence, which had been reinforced the night before. But his heart was uneasy. The hoof prints in the damp earth were still there, clear as a threat. From the barn, Nayeli slowly walked out. Her right leg was wrapped in white bandages, her steps still limping, but her face was brighter. Ahioka ran after her, holding a small basket, chattering about catching some wild berries near the well. Her eyes were clear, strangely innocent, as if she had never known death lurking outside. Ethan looked at them, the corners of his mouth trembling a little. Not quite a smile, but more like an admission. This house, for the first time in many years, was not alone. The sound of horse hooves echoed in the distance, like a hoarse drum beating into the ground. Ethan stopped. Instinct urged him down the steps, eyes narrowing. 3 horsemen were approaching from the trail, red dust swirling behind them. "Get in," he said quickly, his voice low and hoarse. Nayeli immediately pulled her sister toward the barn. Before she entered, she turned back, her dark eyes sharp, her short knife still tucked at her waist. Ethan stood alone in the yard, waiting. His hand tightened on the Winchester, the barrel lowered but ready to be raised at any moment. The 3 horses stopped at the ranch gate. The leader lifted his chin, a crooked smile, his eyes marked with the calluses of someone who had killed without blinking. "I hear this land now harbors Apaches." He exhaled smoke, his voice drawling. "Old man, hand them over. We'll let them go." Ethan stood tall, his shadow long on the ground. "This is the Carter Ranch. Here, it's just me." The other man smirked, glancing into the stable, where Ahioka's slender figure had just appeared and disappeared. He sneered, "Just you? Who is that shadow?" Nayeli stepped out, her posture straight like a warrior, the scar on her cheek glinting in the sunlight. In her hand, a homemade spear was stuck into the ground, ready. Without dodging, she stood right next to Ethan. Her dark eyes locked on the other man. Ethan glanced briefly, then slowly raised the Winchester, the barrel now level with the other man's chest. "She stays," he said. His voice was low, but firm, each word heavy as stone. "This is my land." The air seemed to freeze. The desert wind stopped blowing. The sound of the saddle creaking was clearly audible. The leader spat on the ground, his eyes flashing with malice. "You'll regret it, Carter. The Apache women bring nothing but blood and destruction." Another man put his hand on the butt of his gun, but the leader raised his hand to stop him. He squinted at Ethan, then turned his horse. "We'll be back. Next time, you won't stand a chance." The 3 horses galloped away, red dust covering the road. Ethan stood still, gun in hand, watching them until they disappeared over the grassy knoll. Only then did he lower the barrel and sigh. That afternoon, the Carter Ranch was no longer a quiet place. Ethan brought wood to cover the windows and reinforce the main door. Nayeli pulled the straw out of the barn, gathering it far from the house to prevent fire. Ahioka ran after her, picking up sticks, her small hands covered in dirt. The 3 of them worked tirelessly. No one spoke much, but the look they exchanged was different, no longer suspicious, but ally. At dusk, Ethan placed a chair on the porch, Winchester across his lap. Nayeli sat by the barn door, spear held upright. They didn't talk, but in that silence, there was a strange harmony. Two warriors, two worlds, one enemy. Night fell. The moon cast a cold silver over the ranch. Ethan looked at Nayeli's motionless figure, her eyes shining in the darkness, like a never-ending fire. He understood. She was too used to being hunted. But this time, she wasn't alone. Something stirred in his heart. Since Martha's death, he had never thought of protecting anyone but this land. But now, remembering the proud look in her eyes and the morning words, "We will give you children," Ethan saw that it was no longer just a desperate plea. It had turned into a promise of survival. Outside, the wind carried the scent of smoke from afar. They would return, surely, and when they did, Ranch Carter would not back down. On the third morning since meeting the Apache sisters, the air around the Carter Ranch was heavy like a gathering cloud before a storm. Ethan Carter had risen early, leading his horse along the fence. The rancher's experienced eye read the signs on the ground. Fresh, wet hooves, heading toward the ranch and then turning away. The riders were definitely still lurking. When he returned, he found Nayeli lighting a fire, stirring a thin porridge made from some corn and beans. Ahioka was tidying the yard, her small hands nimble, no longer clumsy like the first day. The entire ranch, which had been quiet for so many years, now echoed with the sounds of sweeping brushes, the sound of burning wood, and the crowing of chickens. These everyday sounds soothed Ethan, but at the same time, they made him more worried. The peace was too fragile. At noon, the sound of horse hooves echoed again, this time clearer. 5 figures appeared on the red line, dust swirling behind. Ethan tightened his gun strap. His eyes narrowed. "They're back," he said softly. Nayeli stood up, her hand tightening on her spear. Ahioka hid behind her, her eyes round with fear. Ethan stepped onto the porch, Winchester strapped to his shoulder. 5 riders stopped at the gate. The leader spat on the ground, his voice hoarse. "Carter, we'll give you one last chance. Hand over those 2 women, and you'll keep your life." Ethan pulled the trigger, his eyes cold. "This is my land. Once through this fence, no one leaves unscathed." Nayeli stepped onto the porch, standing tall beside him. The white bandages around her legs were still raw, but her gaze was as steadfast as stone. No one moved. Only the wind whistled through the fields, carrying the smell of hay and gunpowder. Ahioka shivered behind the door, but did not run. Her eyes followed her, believing she would not bow. The second rider laughed scornfully, drew his gun, but the leader held his hand back. "We have time. Let this old man think he is strong." Then he turned his horse, leaving behind a hiss. "Tonight, Carter, tonight, blood will be shed." When they disappeared behind the hill, the ranch fell into a suffocating silence. Ethan returned, his voice hoarse. "We have a few hours to prepare." All afternoon, the 3 of them worked as if they had never known fatigue. Ethan boarded up the windows and put sandbags in the porch. Nayeli, though her legs still ached, dug trenches around the stables to prevent fires from being lit from outside. Ahioka ran back and forth, carrying water, gathering firewood, her small hands dirty but her eyes shining. The sun was setting. The sky was dyed red as blood. When the crickets began to chirp, Ethan placed a chair on the porch, Winchester across his lap. Nayeli sat near the barn, spear propped up on the ground. They did not speak, but the silence carried the weight of an oath. If the storm came, all 3 would stand together. At midnight, the sky was torn by thunder and lightning. Rain poured down, drenching the yard. Over the sound of the rain, Ethan heard the sound of galloping horses. He was coming. Torches flared in the distance, flickering like ghosts. 6 riders, more numerous this time, surrounded the fence. One threw a bottle of burning oil into the straw, and the fire flared up. But Nayeli's ditch had worked. The fire died out in the pouring rain. "Fire!" came the shout. Bullets whizzed through the tin roof, hitting the wood with a loud clang. Ethan returned fire immediately, each shot sounding solid. From another angle, Nayeli charged, her spear thrust so hard that one of the men fell off his horse, screaming in the rain. Ahioka huddled in the stable, but did not cry. She clutched the broken knife, ready if anyone slipped through. The fight lasted for hours. Bullets flew, rain lashed, flames flashed and died. Finally, the riders fled, leaving two frightened horses behind, curses mingling with the thunder. Ethan was breathing heavily, his shoulders shaking, but Winchester still held on tight. Niley leaned against a pillar, her shoulder bloody, but her eyes still burning. They looked at each other. No words needed, just acknowledgement. Tonight, they were on the same side. When dawn broke, the Carter Ranch was muddy, its wooden walls riddled with bullet holes, but still standing. Inside the small house, a fire was blazing. Ethan sat down, his eyes tired but his heart warm for the first time. Niley placed a calloused hand on the table and whispered, "You chose not to abandon us." Ethan didn't answer, just handed her a cup of hot coffee. His eyes, for the first time in years, were less empty. If you've just lived through Ethan's fiery night, subscribe now. Because the nights aren't done yet, and Ranch Carter will see the choices that will change the fate of these three people. The morning after the storm, the Carter Ranch smelled of gunpowder, wet wood, and mud. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his boots sinking into the mud. The fence still stood, but the wooden posts were still marked with bullet holes. The sandbags in front of the door were soaked, the trench dug around the barn filled with dead leaves and blood. Nayeli sat by the barn post, her shoulders smeared with blood, her eyes closed with exhaustion. Ahioka wrapped a cloth tightly around her arm, her small hand trembling but determined. Ethan stepped forward, gently pushing her aside, his voice hoarse. "Let me." He boiled a pot of water, put the knife in, and turned back. Nayeli opened her eyes, her gaze direct, unwavering. "Again?" Ethan nodded. "If you don't clean it, it will kill you." She gritted her teeth, not making a sound as he pressed the hot cloth to her shoulder, then used the knife to cut open the bruised flesh. Blood flowed out, mixing with the remaining rainwater. Ethan took each step firmly, his hand shaking slightly but his eyes never leaving. For a moment, he saw Martha again, eyes enduring, proud until the last minute. Ahioka stood beside him, clasping her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. But when she saw her sister not collapse, she took a deep breath, raising her head higher. When she was done, Ethan handed Nayeli a dry blanket. "Rest. No one will dare come back today." That afternoon, for the first time in years, the ranch kitchen smelled of cooked food. Ahioka had cooked a thin corn porridge, adding some of the remaining dried meat. Ethan sat at the table, his hand wrapped in a bandage over the scratch on his forehead. Nayeli, her shoulder bandaged in white, also entered, limping but proud. No one said a word, only the sound of spoons hitting bowls, the sound of the wind on the porch. But in that silence, there was something else, no longer unfamiliar, but like an awkward family meal. Ahioka smiled, her eyes sparkling with simple joy. "It's been a long time since we ate under the roof." Ethan bowed his head slightly, his voice hoarse. "It's been a long time since I had someone to sit with." After the meal, Nayeli sat on the porch, her eyes looking far away. She spoke, surprised, not looking at Ethan. "Why didn't you hand us over? You knew they wouldn't stop." Ethan sat down on a wooden chair, his gun across his lap. The wind brought red dust to his shirt, his blue-gray eyes distant. "I lost everything. Once lost, there is nothing worth letting go of. Last night, when you stood next to me, I understood that this land is no longer mine alone." Nayeli turned her face, her eyes deep. She did not speak, but there was recognition in her gaze, a fragile thread that had just been tied. In the evening, the three of them worked together. Ethan rebuilt the sandbags, Nayeli cleared the hay, Ahioka fed the chickens. Small things, but everyone contributed. At dusk, they sat by the fire in the yard. Ethan handed Nayeli a wooden cup filled with hot milk. She took it, nodding slightly in thanks. Ahioka sat next to her, leaning against her shoulder, her eyes slowly closing. In the firelight, Ethan's face showed the hard lines of his face, but his eyes softened. He suddenly remembered his little boy, his laughter, his footsteps running around the porch. The image was faint, but tonight, it no longer choked him. Night fell, and the wind howled in the fields again. Ethan sat on the porch, his gun resting on his shoulder, his eyes looking out into the darkness. Nayeli stepped out, limp but strong. "You knew they would come back." she said softly. You knew, and you still chose to keep us here? Ethan turned to look at her, his voice low and steady. I've lived long enough to know one cannot run forever. Stop. Face. That is the way to survive. Nayeli was silent, her dark eyes flickering in the moonlight. She sat down on the steps, just an arm's length away from him. They both looked out at the meadow, where the darkness swallowed all traces. In that silence, there was something greater than fear. It was a belief, fragile but true. The next morning, as the sun dyed the meadow a golden yellow, Ayoka ran to the well, her laughter echoing in the wind. Nayeli leaned on her spear, walking slowly around the yard. Ethan stood watching, his heart suddenly feeling lighter. Ranch Carter, where once was just a bare wooden wall, now echoed with new sounds. Children's laughter, the footsteps of a strong woman, the sound of a hammer firmly hitting the fence. For the first time in years, Ethan no longer felt like the guardian of a piece of wasteland. He became part of something bigger, a home being rebuilt from the rubble. If you've seen this fragile faith begin to sprout in the red dust of the West, subscribe. Because as soon as the light shines, darkness will test them again, and this bond will come at a cost. The Arizona morning was strangely clear. The sun spread golden light across the fields, but Ethan Carter's heart felt heavy as stone. The fresh hoofprints from the night before were ominous. He knew the riders would return more numerous, more brutal. On the porch, Nayeli sharpened her spear, the steel glinting in the sunlight. Her shoulders were still bandaged, but her deep, dark eyes were burning. Ahyoka sat beside her, weaving hemp rope, her small, nimble hands. They were silent until the sound of hooves echoed back, heavy, pounding like a drum. Nearly a dozen riders emerged from the trail, red dust swirling behind them. Ethan jumped to his feet, Winchester in hand. Nayeli dropped her knife and stood up, spear stuck in the ground. Ahyoka trembled, eyes wide. The horses stopped right in front of the fence. The leader, his face covered in scars, lifted his chin, his voice hoarse. Carter, there is no more bargaining today. Hand over those two women, and you will keep your life. Ethan stood straight, his voice low and hard. This is my land. Once you cross this fence, you will not return. Nayeli stepped forward, her shoulders still bleeding, her spear poised. She stood right next to him, not bowing her head. The leaders sneered, spitting on the ground. You choose to die with them? Okay. Tonight, blood will be spilled here. He pulled the reins, and they all turned their horses, leaving the bloody promise hanging in the wind. When their silhouettes disappeared behind the hill, the Carter ranch fell into a heavy silence. That afternoon, the three of them started preparing. Ethan boarded up the windows, put sandbags in front of the porch. Nayeli cleared the hay out of the barn to prevent fire. Ahyoka, though small, ran back and forth, filling the wooden buckets around the yard with water. Dusk fell, the sky red as blood. Ethan set a chair on the porch, Winchester across his lap. Nayeli sat near the cage, spear propped up on the ground. Ahyoka was inside, but her eyes were fixed outside, not avoiding it. Ethan looked at the two sisters, his voice hoarse. I lost everything. If they come, we will fall. But fall together. Nayeli touched his gun, her eyes burning. We promised to give birth to your child. That promise was to stay. Even if blood is shed, this is still home. Ethan choked, only nodded. Outside, the darkness was thick. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance. The storm was approaching, and this time, no one was allowed to retreat. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, drowning out the wind howling through the fields. Ranch Carter shook with bullets and hooves. Ethan Carter stood in front of the porch, a Winchester burning hot in his hand, his arm shot but still clenched, his eyes blazing like fire. Beside him, Nayeli swung his spear, each blow fierce, his shoulders bloody but his eyes proud. Ahyoka was inside the house, her hands shaking but not running away, constantly pouring water to extinguish the torches the riders threw on the roof. A fragile family. But tonight, they stood in a line. The riders rushed in, red fire, smoke swirling. Ethan pulled the trigger, each precise shot felling the rider. Nayeli charged, spear thrusting hard, steel piercing the chaos. Ahioka screamed as one jumped the fence, but Ethan spun his gun, taking him down before he could get close. The night filled with the smell of smoke, dust, and blood. But Ranch Carter did not fall. A bullet grazed Nayeli's shoulder, blood streaking white. Ahioka screamed, throwing the broken knife at the shooter, knocking him down. Ethan fired the last shot, bringing him down with a deafening crash. 3 people, a rancher, an Apache warrior, a girl, stood back to back, fighting the pack of wolves. The bodies of the riders were scattered in the yard. The survivors faltered, their eyes blazing with hatred but their hands shaking. The leader, the scarred one, tightened his reins, shouting, "We'll come back." Ethan lifted Winchester, his voice steely. "Going through this fence again. No one will survive." In the tense silence, he spat, then turned his horse and rode away. Their silhouettes faded, leaving only smoke and exhaustion. Ethan dropped his gun, his shoulders slumped. Nayeli sat against the pillar, sweat mixed with blood, but her eyes did not lose fire. Ahioka hugged her, tears falling from her eyes with relief. Ethan walked over, trembling as he bandaged Nayeli's wound. She looked at him, tired but proud. "You see? We promised to give you children, but that was the promise of a home." Ethan fell silent, his eyes meeting those deep black ones, then looked at Ahioka. In his heart, for the first time in years, there was a family. The red sun rose, light covering the grasslands. Ranch Carter was devastated, but still standing. Ethan sat on the steps, Nayeli and Ahioka beside him. He said softly, "From today, this is no longer just my ranch. This is our home." Nayeli squeezed his hand. Ahioka rested her head on her shoulder. And in that dawn, 3 people who seemed lost found a reason to live on, not just to survive, but to start again. If you believe that love can blossom in the wild, please give me a subscribe button to join us in exploring romantic and mysterious love stories in the Wild West. Each story will take you to the emotional hidden corners of this land. Don't miss it. Let's continue the story.